For 12 long years, Sister Margaret dedicated every breath, every prayer, every waking moment to God. She had given up everything, her dreams of marriage, children, a normal life, all for her sacred calling. But what happens when the very walls meant to protect your faith become the prison of your deepest shame? What happens when the men you trust most with your soul become the ones who destroy it? Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a woman who thought she knew what sacrifice meant, a woman who discovered that even behind convent walls, temptation doesn't just knock once. It comes disguised as holy men, whispering promises of comfort and understanding. 2 priests, 1 sister, and a secret so devastating that when it finally came to light, it didn't just destroy lives. It shattered an entire community's faith in everything they held sacred. Imagine giving your entire existence to God, believing you're walking the righteous path, only to find yourself trapped between 2 men who were supposed to guide you to heaven, but instead led you straight into hell. This isn't just a story about broken vows. It's about broken trust, broken hearts, and the kind of betrayal that cuts so deep. It changes everyone. It touches forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sister Margaret wasn't born to be a nun. At least that's not how her story began. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she was just like any other girl, dreaming of love, marriage, maybe a house with a white picket fence and children running through the backyard. But life has a way of changing course when you least expect it. When Margaret was 17, her younger brother died in a car accident. The grief was so overwhelming, so consuming, that she found herself spending hours in the local church, seeking answers, seeking peace, seeking something. It was there, kneeling in that wooden pew with tears streaming down her face, that she felt what she believed was God's calling. The priest, Father Williams, was kind to her during those dark months. He told her that sometimes God uses our deepest pain to show us our true purpose. Maybe, he said gently, this tragedy is God's way of calling you to serve him completely. At 18, Margaret entered the convent. She was young, idealistic, and absolutely certain that she was making the right choice. The first few years were everything she expected. The routine of prayer, the sense of community with the other sisters, the feeling that she was truly serving a higher purpose. It filled the void that her brother's death had left behind. But as the years passed, something began to change. The other sisters, most of them older, seemed content with their lives of service. They found joy in their daily routines, in their prayers, in their work with the community. But Margaret began to feel something she hadn't anticipated. Loneliness. It started small. A fleeting thought while watching a young couple walk past the convent garden, holding hands and laughing. A pang of something she couldn't quite name when she saw a mother playing with her children at the church picnic. She pushed these thoughts away, telling herself they were tests of her faith. She prayed harder, worked longer hours, threw herself into her duties with renewed determination. But the feelings didn't go away. If anything, they grew stronger. That's when Father Michael arrived at their parish. He was different from the older priests Margaret had known. At 35, he was charismatic, modern in his approach to faith, and had a way of making everyone feel special when he spoke to them. He had been assigned to their church after completing advanced theological studies, and the congregation was immediately drawn to his passionate sermons and his genuine interest in their lives. Margaret first noticed Father Michael during confession. His voice was gentle but strong, and unlike the mechanical responses she'd grown accustomed to from other priests, he seemed to really listen. He asked thoughtful questions, offered comfort that felt personal rather than scripted. "Sister Margaret," he said, after one particularly emotional confession about her struggles with loneliness, "God doesn't expect us to be perfect. He expects us to be human. Your feelings don't make you weak. They make you real." Those words stayed with her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was failing in her calling. She felt understood. Father Michael began seeking her out for conversations about theology, about her work in the community, about her thoughts on various church matters. These conversations were innocent enough at first, but there was something in the way he looked at her, the way he seemed to value her opinions, that made Margaret feel alive. Around the same time, Father Joseph, the senior priest at their parish, began paying more attention to Margaret as well. Father Joseph was 52, well respected in the community, and had been serving at their church for over 15 years. He was the kind of priest that everyone turned to for guidance, the one called upon for the most serious matters of faith and family crises. Margaret had always respected him from a distance, but their relationship changed when he asked her to assist him with counseling sessions for troubled couples. Working so closely with Father Joseph revealed a different side of him. Behind his authoritative presence, Margaret discovered a man who carried the weight of everyone's problems on his shoulders. He confided in her about the challenges of his role, the loneliness of being the one everyone relied on, but having no one to rely on himself. "Sometimes, sister," he told her during one late evening as they were organizing files in his office, "I wonder if I chose this life, or if it chose me." These moments of vulnerability created an intimacy that Margaret hadn't experienced with anyone in years. Father Joseph began calling her his trusted advisor, asking for her input on difficult parish decisions. He would place his hand on her shoulder when thanking her, let his touch linger just a moment longer than necessary. Margaret told herself it was nothing, just the natural closeness that comes from working together, from sharing the burdens of ministry. But deep down, she knew something was changing. The way her heart raced when Father Michael smiled at her during Mass, the warmth that spread through her chest when Father Joseph praised her work in front of other parishioners. These weren't the feelings a nun was supposed to have. These weren't the thoughts that belonged in a mind dedicated to God. Margaret began spending more time in prayer, desperately asking for guidance, for strength, for the ability to push these confusing emotions away. But the more she tried to suppress them, the stronger they seemed to become. She found herself looking forward to her conversations with Father Michael, treasuring the moments when Father Joseph would ask for her help with private matters. She was walking a dangerous line, and somewhere deep in her heart, she knew it. The first time something inappropriate happened, it was with Father Joseph. Margaret was helping him organize old church records in the basement storage room late one evening. The space was cramped, and they found themselves standing very close together as they reached for boxes on high shelves. When Father Joseph turned to hand her a heavy file box, their bodies brushed against each other. Instead of stepping away, he paused, looking directly into her eyes. "Margaret," he whispered, using her first name instead of her title for the first time. "I need to tell you something." His hand came up to touch her face, and before she could process what was happening, his lips were on hers. The kiss lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily, staring at each other in shock and confusion. "I'm sorry," Father Joseph said immediately. "I don't know what came over me. This can never happen again." But even as he spoke the words, his hand was still touching her cheek, and Margaret could see in his eyes that he didn't really mean it. That night, Margaret knelt by her bed for hours, praying for forgiveness, promising God that she would never let such a thing happen again. But the memory of that kiss, the feeling of being wanted, of being desired, it haunted her dreams and filled her thoughts during prayer. 2 weeks later, it was Father Michael's turn to cross the line. Margaret had been struggling with a particularly difficult situation involving a young woman in the parish who was pregnant and unmarried. The girl's parents had disowned her, and Margaret was trying to help find resources and support. Father Michael found her crying in the chapel after a especially heartbreaking conversation with the girl. "Hey," he said softly, sliding into the pew beside her. "You can't carry everyone's pain, Margaret. You have such a beautiful heart, but you're going to break it trying to fix everyone else's problems." His arm went around her shoulders in what started as a comforting gesture, but as Margaret looked up at him through her tears, something shifted in the air between them. "I see how much you care," Father Michael continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see how much love you have to give. It's not fair that you have to keep it all locked away." This time, Margaret didn't resist when he kissed her. This time, she kissed him back, pouring all of her loneliness, all of her suppressed desires, all of her need for human connection into that stolen moment. If you're still following, type, "I'm still here," in the comments. Let's see who's really watching this far. Both men, in their own ways, began justifying these lapses. Father Joseph told Margaret that God understood human weakness, that their connection was spiritual as much as physical, that sometimes the Lord worked through love in all its forms. Father Michael convinced her that their feelings were pure, that denying the love God had placed in their hearts was actually a sin in itself, that they were meant to comfort each other in their service to others. Margaret found herself living in a constant state of internal conflict. Part of her knew what they were doing was wrong, was a betrayal of everything she had pledged her life to. But another part of her, the part that had been starved for affection and human connection for so many years, rationalized these relationships as something beautiful, something necessary, something that made her a better person and a more compassionate servant of God. The dangerous triangle that was forming between Margaret, Father Joseph, and Father Michael was about to become even more complicated. Neither priest knew about the other's involvement with Sister Margaret. Both believed they were her only confidant, her only source of comfort in a life of sacrifice and service. And Margaret, caught between them, was spiraling deeper into a web of deception and desire that would soon trap all three of them in ways none of them could have imagined. What started as moments of weakness were becoming patterns of behavior. What began as emotional comfort was evolving into physical intimacy that would soon have consequences none of them were prepared to face. The stage was set for a scandal that would rock their entire community to its core. But for now, in those stolen moments of forbidden connection, all three of them were lost in the illusion that they could keep their secrets forever. Little did they know, secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially when they involve the creation of new life. The path Margaret was walking would soon lead to a revelation that would force all of them to face the true cost of their choices, and the price would be higher than any of them had ever imagined. 3 months after the first kiss with Father Joseph, and 2 months after her first intimate moment with Father Michael, Sister Margaret began noticing changes in her body that terrified her more than anything she had ever experienced in her life. At first, she dismissed the nausea as stress, the fatigue as overwork, the missed periods as the result of emotional turmoil. But as the weeks passed and the symptoms intensified, a horrifying possibility began to take shape in her mind. Margaret had been intimate with both priests on multiple occasions. What had started as isolated incidents of weakness had become a pattern of secret encounters. Father Joseph would find reasons to keep her late after evening prayers, leading her to his private office where their conversations about ministry would dissolve into passionate embraces. Father Michael would suggest walks in the convent garden during the early morning hours, where behind the rose bushes and tall hedges they would hold each other with a desperate hunger that neither could name or resist. The morning Margaret woke up and immediately ran to the bathroom to vomit. She knew her worst fears were confirmed. Sitting on the cold tile floor, her head spinning and her heart pounding, she faced a reality that seemed impossible. She was pregnant, a nun, carrying a child, and the father could be either of 2 priests who had sworn the same vows of celibacy that she had broken. For 3 days, Margaret said nothing to anyone. She went through her daily routines like a robot, leading morning prayers with the other sisters, teaching catechism to the parish children, helping prepare meals in the convent kitchen, all while her mind raced with panic and disbelief. How could this have happened? How could she have been so reckless, so foolish, so completely blind to the consequences of her actions? The weight of her situation became crushing. During Mass, as she knelt in prayer, she would feel waves of nausea that had nothing to do with morning sickness and everything to do with the overwhelming guilt and terror of what she had done. Every time she looked at the crucifix, she felt like she was staring into the eyes of a God she had betrayed in the most profound way possible. Finally, unable to bear the burden alone any longer, Margaret decided she had to tell Father Joseph first. She had known him longer, and in some ways, their relationship felt more like a partnership built on their work together in the parish. Surely he would know what to do. Surely, as the senior priest, he would have wisdom and guidance for a situation this catastrophic. She found him in his office after evening Mass, working on his sermon for the following Sunday. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to confess the most shameful secret of her life to a man who was equally responsible for it, in a room where they had shared some of their most passionate moments. "Father Joseph," she said quietly, closing the door behind her and turning the lock, a gesture that had become routine for their private conversations. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise me you won't hate me when you hear it." Father Joseph looked up from his papers, immediately sensing the gravity in her voice. "Margaret, you could never do anything that would make me hate you. What is it?" The words felt like they were being torn from her throat. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. Father Joseph's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally, panic. He stood up from his desk so quickly that his chair fell backward, hitting the wall with a loud crash. "That's impossible," he whispered, but even as he said it, his eyes were scanning her body, looking for signs he had been too distracted by desire to notice before. "How? When? Are you certain?" "I'm certain," Margaret replied, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "All the signs are there, the nausea, the fatigue. I've missed 2 periods. Father, what are we going to do?" The question hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Father Joseph began pacing the small office like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "This can't be happening," he kept saying. "This can't be happening." When he finally stopped pacing and looked at Margaret, she barely recognized the man she thought she knew. Gone was the gentle confidence, the steady wisdom that had drawn her to him in the first place. In his place was a man consumed by terror and self-preservation. "You have to take care of this," he said in a voice that was cold and calculating. "There are ways. There are doctors who... Margaret, you cannot have this baby. Do you understand what this would do to both of us? To the church? To everyone who looks up to us for guidance?" The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Take care of this. The euphemism was clear, but hearing it from the mouth of a priest, a man who preached about the sanctity of life every Sunday, made her feel sick all over again. "You're talking about an abortion?" She whispered the word like a curse. "I'm talking about survival," Father Joseph replied firmly. "I'm talking about protecting the greater good. Think about all the families in this parish who depend on this church, who depend on their faith to get them through their darkest moments. Think about what would happen if this scandal came to light. We would destroy not just ourselves, but the faith of hundreds of people." Margaret left that meeting feeling more alone and desperate than she had ever felt in her life. The man she had trusted with her deepest secrets, her most intimate moments, had reduced their relationship and their unborn child to a problem that needed to be eliminated. But the worst part was that she could see his logic, could understand his fear, could even imagine herself making the same argument if the situation were different. 2 days later, unable to live with the secret and the pressure from Father Joseph to handle the situation quickly, Margaret decided she had to tell Father Michael as well. Maybe he would react differently. Maybe his younger, more modern approach to faith would offer a different perspective, a solution that didn't involve destroying the life growing inside her. She found him in the church late one evening, practicing his sermon in front of the empty pews. The sight of him there, so handsome and earnest in his devotion, made her heart ache with a mixture of love and regret that was almost unbearable. "Michael," she called softly, using his first name as she had begun to do during their most intimate moments. "I need to talk to you about something important." Father Michael smiled when he saw her, his face lighting up with the warmth that had first drawn her to him. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that these next words would change everything between them forever. "I'm pregnant, Michael, and the baby could be yours." The color drained from Father Michael's face so quickly that Margaret thought he might faint. He gripped the back of the pew in front of him, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to process what she had just told him. "Could be mine?" he repeated slowly. "What do you mean, could be?" And there it was, the question Margaret had been dreading most. She had to tell him about Father Joseph. She had to admit that she had been intimate with both of them, that she didn't know which one was the father of her child. The shame of that admission was almost worse than the initial confession of pregnancy. "There's someone else," she whispered, unable to meet his eyes. "Another relationship. I don't know who the father is." Father Michael's reaction was different from Father Joseph's, but no less devastating. Instead of immediate panic about protecting their reputations, his first response was heartbreak. "Someone else?" he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "All this time, all these moments we've shared, I thought what we had was special. I thought I was the only one you were special," Margaret said desperately, reaching for his hand. "You both were. This isn't about choosing one over the other. This is about feelings that got out of control, about loneliness and need and—" "Both?" Father Michael interrupted. "Both of us are priests? Margaret, do you understand what you've done? Do you understand the position you've put all of us in?" The conversation that followed was a mixture of accusation, heartbreak, and growing panic as Father Michael began to understand the full scope of the situation. Unlike Father Joseph, who had immediately jumped to practical solutions, Father Michael seemed more concerned with the emotional and spiritual implications of their actions. "This child," he said finally, his hand instinctively moving toward Margaret's still flat stomach, "this innocent life. How do we even begin to figure out what the right thing to do is?" But even as he spoke about the child with more tenderness than Father Joseph had shown, Margaret could see the fear growing in his eyes, the fear of exposure, of losing everything he had worked for, of being destroyed by a scandal that would follow him for the rest of his life. What does the other priest think we should do?" Father Michael asked quietly. "He wants me to end the pregnancy," Margaret admitted, the words feeling like poison on her tongue. Father Michael was quiet for a long time, wrestling with thoughts and emotions that Margaret could only guess at. Finally, he looked at her with eyes full of pain and said, Maybe that would be for the best, for all of us, for the baby too in a way. What kind of life could a child have, born from this kind of situation?" Hearing similar words from both men sent Margaret into a spiral of despair, deeper than anything she had experienced since her brother's death. The two people she had trusted most in the world, the two men she had given her body and heart to, both wanted her to destroy the child they had helped create. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Carry the child or risk it all with an abortion? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Over the following days, Margaret felt like she was drowning in a sea of impossible choices. Both priests began pressuring her, each in their own way, to terminate the pregnancy as quickly and quietly as possible. Father Joseph focused on the practical aspects, researching doctors in distant cities who would perform the procedure with discretion, calculating how much money they would need and how they could arrange for Margaret to be away from the convent without raising suspicions. Father Michael's pressure was more emotional and spiritual. He spoke about mercy, about God's understanding of impossible situations, about the greater good that would be served by ending a pregnancy that could destroy the faith of so many people who depended on them for spiritual guidance. Neither of them offered to support her if she decided to have the baby. Neither suggested finding a way to make the situation work, to take responsibility for their actions and face the consequences together. Both were focused entirely on making the problem disappear so they could return to their lives as if nothing had happened. Caught between their pressure and her own conscience, Margaret began researching her options alone. She spent hours in the convent library looking up information about pregnancy, about abortion procedures, about adoption. She even began researching herbal remedies that some websites claimed could induce miscarriage, desperate to find a solution that wouldn't require her to leave the convent or involve doctors who might ask questions. The isolation was crushing. Margaret couldn't confide in any of the other sisters without exposing the entire situation. She couldn't seek counsel from other priests without risking discovery. She couldn't even pray with the same faith she had once possessed, because every time she tried to communicate with God, all she could think about was how profoundly she had failed in her calling. The physical symptoms of pregnancy were becoming harder to hide. Morning sickness struck at unpredictable times, forcing Margaret to excuse herself from prayers and meals with increasing frequency. Her usual energy was replaced by a constant fatigue that made it difficult to keep up with her duties. Other sisters began commenting on her pale complexion, her loss of appetite, her frequent trips to the bathroom. "Sister Margaret, are you feeling well?" Sister Catherine, the eldest nun in their community, asked one morning after Margaret had to rush out of morning prayers for the third time in a week. "You seem to be struggling with some kind of illness. Perhaps you should see a doctor." The suggestion of medical attention sent waves of panic through Margaret. A doctor would immediately recognize her condition, would ask questions she couldn't answer, would create records that could expose everything. "I'm fine, Sister Catherine," she replied weakly. "Just a stomach bug that's taking longer than usual to clear up." But Margaret knew she couldn't keep up the charade much longer. Her body was changing, her secrets were becoming harder to hide, and the pressure from both priests was intensifying. Father Joseph had found a doctor in a city 3 hours away who would perform the procedure, no questions asked, for a substantial cash payment. Father Michael had arranged for Margaret to have a spiritual retreat that would provide cover for her absence. Everything was falling into place for Margaret to end her pregnancy and return to her life as if nothing had happened. But as the date they had set approached, Margaret found herself unable to go through with it. Every time she tried to convince herself that abortion was the right choice, the only choice, something deep inside her rebelled against the idea. This was a child, a life, a human being who had been created out of love, even if that love was complicated and forbidden. How could she destroy something so innocent because of the mistakes that she and 2 grown men had made? How could she compound one sin with another that felt even more grave? 3 nights before the planned procedure, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Instead of ending her pregnancy, she decided to try one of the herbal remedies she had researched online. If God wanted this child to be born, the herbs wouldn't work. If he wanted to end the pregnancy naturally, this would be his way of doing it. She was putting the decision in God's hands rather than taking it into her own. Margaret bought the herbs from a health food store in the next town, telling the clerk she was making tea for a friend with digestive problems. That evening, alone in her small room, she brewed the mixture and drank it, praying that whatever happened would be God's will. The herbs were stronger than she had expected. Within hours, Margaret was experiencing severe cramping and nausea that went far beyond normal morning sickness. By midnight, she was doubled over in pain, sweating and shaking as her body reacted to the substances she had ingested. Margaret tried to endure the pain silently, not wanting to wake the other sisters or draw attention to her condition. But as the hours passed and the cramping intensified, she realized that something was going seriously wrong. This wasn't the gentle, natural miscarriage she had hoped for. This was a medical emergency. At 3 in the morning, Margaret finally had to call for help. Her cries of pain woke Sister Catherine, who immediately called for an ambulance when she found Margaret collapsed on her bedroom floor, pale and bleeding. The ride to the hospital was a blur of pain and fear. As the paramedics worked to stabilize her condition, Margaret knew that her secret was about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible. There would be no quiet resolution, no discreet handling of the situation. Everything was about to come to light, and she was powerless to stop it. The emergency room doctor who examined Margaret was professional but direct. After running tests and examining her condition, he confirmed what she already knew. "Sister, you're approximately 12 weeks pregnant, and it appears you've ingested something that's causing a severe reaction. We need to know exactly what you took so we can treat you properly." The moment she had dreaded for months had finally arrived. Sister Margaret, surrounded by medical professionals and facing potentially life-threatening complications, had no choice but to tell the truth. The secret she had tried so desperately to keep, the situation she and two priests had tried so hard to manage privately, was about to become public knowledge in the most shocking way possible. As Margaret lay in that hospital bed, fighting for her life and her baby's life, she realized that all of their careful planning, all of their attempts to control the situation and minimize damage, had been in vain. The truth, as it always does, was finding its way to the surface, and when it emerged completely, it would be more devastating than any of them had imagined. The phone calls from the hospital to the convent, the questions from other sisters, the need to contact her religious superiors, it was all beginning. The scandal that would rock their entire community was about to unfold, and Sister Margaret, lying in that hospital bed with tubes and monitors attached to her body, could only pray that she and her unborn child would survive long enough to face whatever consequences awaited them. Father Joseph and Father Michael, both of whom would soon receive emergency calls about Margaret's hospitalization, had no idea that their carefully constructed walls of secrecy were about to crumble completely. The reckoning they had tried so hard to avoid was finally at hand, and it would demand a price from all of them that none of them were prepared to pay. The call came to Father Joseph first, at 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide his life into before and after. Sister Catherine's voice was shaking as she delivered the news that would shatter everything he thought he had under control. "Father, you need to get to St. Mary's Hospital immediately. Sister Margaret has been rushed to the emergency room. She's pregnant, Father. The doctors say she's been pregnant for months, and she took something that nearly killed her and the baby." The phone slipped from Father Joseph's trembling hands, clattering to the floor of his bedroom as the weight of Sister Catherine's words hit him like a physical blow. All of their planning, all of their careful arrangements to handle this quietly and privately, had just been destroyed in a single moment of desperation. Within an hour, both Father Joseph and Father Michael were at the hospital, each arriving separately but with the same look of terror in their eyes. They found Margaret in the intensive care unit, hooked up to machines that monitored both her vital signs and the baby's heartbeat. She was conscious but weak, her face pale and drawn from pain and exhaustion. Sister Catherine and two other nuns from the convent were already there, speaking in hushed tones with doctors and asking questions that made both priests realize how completely their secret had been exposed. There was no covering this up, no managing the narrative, no quiet resolution that would let them all return to their normal lives. "The herb she ingested could have killed her," Dr. Sarah Martinez explained to the assembled group. "We've managed to stabilize both mother and baby, but she's going to need extensive monitoring for the next several weeks. I have to ask, does anyone know why a nun would attempt to terminate her pregnancy using such dangerous methods? This suggests a level of desperation that concerns me greatly." The question hung in the air like an accusation, and both priests felt the weight of eyes turning toward them, searching for answers they couldn't give without destroying themselves. Sister Catherine, who had been Margaret's mentor and closest friend in the community for over a decade, was staring at the two men with a growing understanding that made their blood run cold. "I think," Sister Catherine said slowly, her voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the room pay attention, "that there are some questions that need to be answered about how Sister Margaret found herself in this condition, and I think those answers need to come from the people she trusted most." Over the next 48 hours, as Margaret recovered under medical supervision, the walls of secrecy that had protected all three of them began crumbling with devastating speed. The hospital required contact information for the baby's father for medical purposes. Other sisters began asking pointed questions about Margaret's recent behavior, her frequent private meetings with both priests, the way she had been avoiding community activities for months. Father Michael cracked first. Unable to bear the weight of guilt and the constant questioning from church elders who had been called in to investigate the situation, he requested a private meeting with the Mother Superior of Margaret's order and the bishop of their diocese. "I need to confess something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper as he sat across from two of the most powerful figures in their religious hierarchy. I was involved with Sister Margaret, intimately involved. I broke my vows, and I may be the father of her child. The confession sent shockwaves through the church leadership, but the aftershocks were just beginning. When pressed for details about how long the relationship had been going on and whether anyone else was involved, Father Michael's resolve completely collapsed. "There was someone else," he admitted, the words coming out in a rush of shame and desperation. "Another priest. Father Joseph was also involved with her. She doesn't know which one of us is the father." The bishop, a man who had seen many scandals in his 40 years of church leadership, later said that nothing had prepared him for the scope of what Father Michael was confessing. Two priests, both violating their vows with the same nun, resulting in a pregnancy that had nearly killed her when she tried to abort it using dangerous herbs. It was a scandal of proportions that would rock not just their parish, but the entire diocese. Father Joseph, when confronted with Father Michael's confession, initially tried to deny everything, but faced with evidence that investigators had begun uncovering, private gifts he had given Margaret, witnesses who had seen them together in compromising situations, his own written notes about handling the Margaret situation, his denials quickly crumbled. "And I never meant for any of this to happen," he said during his own confession to church authorities. "It started innocently, just counseling, just friendship. But Margaret was so lonely, so in need of comfort, and I lost sight of my duties, my vows, my calling. I betrayed everything I was supposed to represent." When asked about the pressure he had put on Margaret to terminate her pregnancy, Father Joseph's attempts at justification only made his situation worse. "I was trying to protect the church, to protect the faith of our parishioners. I thought if we could handle this quietly, no one would have to be hurt by our mistakes." The investigation that followed was thorough and merciless. Church authorities interviewed every member of the convent, every parishioner who had worked closely with the three individuals involved, every person who might have witnessed inappropriate behavior or noticed warning signs that had been overlooked. What they discovered painted a picture of a community where warning signs had been ignored, where inappropriate relationships had been allowed to develop under the guise of spiritual guidance, where three people had allowed their human desires to override their sacred commitments in ways that put everyone around them at risk. Margaret, still recovering in the hospital, found herself at the center of a storm of judgment and speculation that was almost as devastating as her medical emergency had been. Some people viewed her as a victim, a lonely woman who had been taken advantage of by men in positions of power over her. Others saw her as equally responsible, a woman who had seduced two holy men and betrayed her own vows in the process. The parish community that had once looked up to all three of them was torn apart by the revelations. Families who had trusted Father Joseph to counsel them through marital problems felt betrayed and disgusted. Young people who had seen Father Michael as a role model felt confused and lost. Parishioners who had viewed Sister Margaret as a symbol of pure devotion to God felt their own faith shaken by her fall from grace. "How can we trust anything they taught us?" asked Maria Rodriguez, a parishioner who had attended the church for over 20 years. "If they could lie about something this fundamental, this basic to who they were supposed to be, what else were they lying about? How do we know what was real and what was just performance? The local media, once they caught wind of the story, descended on the small parish community like vultures. Headlines screamed about the nun's secret pregnancy scandal and the two priests' one-sister love triangle. The story had everything that draws public attention: religious hypocrisy, forbidden romance, a near-death experience, and the destruction of trust in institutions that people are supposed to be able to rely on. Margaret, watching the news coverage from her hospital bed, realized that her attempt to keep the situation private had actually made it infinitely more public and damaging than if they had simply confessed their relationships and dealt with the consequences honestly from the beginning. Their attempts to manage and control the scandal had turned it into a story so sensational that it captured national attention.